Boštjan works at the intersection between contemporary continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, biopolitics, political theology, and critical economic and social theories. Boštjan is the author of Ontology and Perversion on Deleuze, Agamben, and Lacan, published in 2019, and the co-editor of Lacan and Deleuze, a disjunctive synthesis, published in 2017, and more recently, the co-editor of Objective Fictions, Philosophy, Psychoanalysis, Marxism, published by Edinburgh in 2022. The title of Boštjan's paper today is fascinating: A Theft Without a Thief, Anamorphosis of Surplus Value. Boštjan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for this intro, and to both Lorenzo and Tadej for organizing the third in a row, which means it's not a trilogy, but a series. Not gonna lose time, so let me just jump into the paper. A Theft Without a Thief, Anamorphosis of Surplus Value. In his book, Stealing the Mona Lisa, What Art Stops Us From Seeing, Darian Leader reports on the strange consequences of the theft of the Mona Lisa painting from Louvre on August 21, 1911. Recall, the painting was stolen by Vincenzo Peruggia, Louvre's house painter, who took the painting from its place and brought it into his modest apartment in Paris, where it remained for about 2 years. When Louvre staff realized that the empty place of the famous painting is not empty due to the fact that Mona Lisa was transferred into the room in Louvre dedicated to the routine photo sessions of the paintings, but was actually stolen, immediately sounded the alarm that started a vast police investigation, which lasted for months and then years. When Louvre reopened after a week of initial investigation, so Leader reports, it faced a strange fact. The theft significantly increased the number of visitors to the Louvre who did not come to visit the painting itself, but the empty space or place left by the missing masterpiece. For Leader, the theft of the Mona Lisa made itself visible by showing the split between the void, what Lacan calls in Seminar 7, das Ding, and the image that occupies this empty space, which is the basic operation that makes all creations possible, including the artistic ones. We watch and see the artistic products because they occupy the empty place or void of das Ding, that is to say, because of that which we don't see in it or in them. Differently put, art and similar products attracts us because of the surplus they contain in themselves, which is precisely the nothingness. In this respect, one could argue that there is a kernel of truth in the fact of masses of people staring into the empty place. They came to see precisely the surplus, the void, which is the object of our ordinary gazes and looks. And like I said, the split between the missing image and the empty place made the theft fully visible. This view is entirely consistent with Lacan's idea that the theft can only take place within the symbolic, insofar as it presupposes the difference between the symbol and the empty place of its inscription. As he argued in the seminar on the Purloined Letter, only the symbolic can be absent from its place, not the real. The real is always dragging its own place behind it. In contrast to the theft of the Mona Lisa, however, Dupin's theft of the Purloined Letter in Edgar Allan Poe's short story was effective precisely to the extent that it remained invisible. Dupin left the duplicate, the double of the letter on its place, on the place of the stolen letter itself. And the duplicate of the letter, it was the one that made the theft invisible. This case raises the more general question of how structural thefts without the thieves, are possible, such as the thefts of the surplus labor time in wage system or homologically the subject's gaze in anamorphic art, or in art in general. Anamorphic art is a specific case which I will deal with in what follows. Why we are so obsessed with the visible theft, but remain indifferent to invisible structural theft, even though we know it very well. In what follows, I will contend that both theft of the gaze in Anamorphosis and the theft of the surplus labor time in capitalist mode of production can be disavowed precisely because of the objective fictions that allow them to remain invisible. Not only there is not subjective theft, and recall, for Marx, capitalists are only the personification of the process of accumulation of capital, which runs independently of particular individual capitalist, but the skull and wage, respectively, are covering up the theft itself. So section number 1, value of labor and surplus value. In a well-known and extensively discussed passage of Seminar 17, Lacan says, and I'm quoting, "Something changed in the master discourse at a certain point in history. We are not going break our backs, finding out of it was because of the Luther or Calvin or some unknown traffic of ships around Genova or in the Mediterranean Sea or anywhere else. For the important point is that on a certain day, surplus jouissance became calculable, could be counted, totalized. That is what is it called the accumulation of capital. That is where what is called the accumulation of capital begins." End of quote. Much has been written on the homology between Marx's surplus value and Lacan's surplus jouissance, which contains the core of the above cited passage, and I'm not going here into much details because I'm sure most of you are very well aware of it. However, at least one point of this homology has remained substantially less illuminated and conceptualized than others. It is worth asking on how on a certain day surplus jouissance begin to count. What is the logic of the counting, and especially under what conditions does surplus jouissance begin to count and add up as surplus value? Lacan's and Marx's answer to the above question are basically the same. They are only articulated differently. But the answer is also, in both cases, twofold. Let us begin with Lacan. As he himself mentioned at the beginning of the cited passage, the condition of the counting on surplus value is a change in master discourse, which, as Alenka Zupancic has repeatedly noted, refers precisely to the separation of knowledge from labor. Recall that the starting point of Lacan's theory of discourses is the master-slave dialectic, which is at the core of the discourse of the ancient master. This discourse is characterized by jouissance and knowledge being on the side of the slave and not on the master, and not on the side of the master. The essence of the master is that he does not know what he wants. With both elements, jouissance and knowledge, being immediately codependent in the form of slave's practical knowledge or savoir-faire. According to Lacan, the modern age is marked by the discursive break, which is based on the spoliation of slaves' knowledge. The modern knowledge on which capitalism is based on is scientific knowledge or episteme. In comparison to the ancient savoir-faire, the fundamental characteristics of episteme is that it is separated from slaves' labor and as such transferable. That has important implications, of course. By taking the place of the agency of the university discourse, knowledge must disavow labor as its truth, whereby the form of this disavowal is a constant valorization of the surplus created precisely by so-called surplus labor. As Lacan emphasizes, what the ancient slave is spoliated of here is not his or her labor, or simply the products of his or her labor, but his or her knowledge as savoir-faire. It is precisely in this discursive constellation, or with this discursive shift, we could call it even discursive theft, because this is what this is about, from the master discourse to the university discourse, that labor, separated from knowledge, begins to function as a real loss or entropy. which is precisely the fount of labor time that, according to Marx, is the source of surplus value. Put differently, labor becomes separated from labor time and takes the form of a stain within the knowledge, something that must necessarily be concealed if knowledge as episteme is to function as an agency of the discourse. Here, Marx's answer to the problem of the counting on surplus value is quite compatible with Lacan's, only that Marx formulates it in a historical terms. The condition of counting and of the production of the surplus value is the separation of man from the means of production at the end of the feudal epoch. It is this separation that further enables the capitalist as the owner of capital to find on the market workers as the possessor of labor power, characterized by having nothing to sell on the market, quote unquote, except their labor power, their working arms and brains, end of quote. Both are formally, legally free and equal persons who sign an employment contract by which the worker, as the possessor of labor power, makes his or her labor power available to the owner of capital for a determined, that's crucial, that means not unlimited time and payment. The compensation is the wage. The spontaneous ideological understanding of this situation is the following. Labor creates value by which the owner of capital covers all the costs, in addition to the worker's wage, also the other production costs, such as machines, raw materials, etc., and must then sell the products or services at the higher price, with the difference between the selling price and the cost being precisely the surplus value, which gives rise to profit. According to this explanation, surplus value emerges in the process of exchange or circulation and not in the process of production. However, such is actually not the case. In really nice, and I cannot recommend it more, essay, Wage, Price and Profit, which is written almost simultaneously with the Capital, Volume 1, Marx is categorical about it. I quote, "To explain, therefore, the general nature of profits, you must start from the theorem that, on an average, commodities are sold on their real values, and that profits are derived from selling them at their values, that is, in proportion to the quantity of labor realized in them," end of quote. What does it mean that the profit is already derived from selling products at the real values without all surcharges that the owner of capital can or cannot afford in view of the monopolistic or competitive market position of his or her products? In answering this question, we need to step onto the terrain of the famous labor theory of value. In the market, the products of labor are sold or exchanged for the universal equivalent, which is money, because the same amount of abstract or simple human labor measured by abstract or simple labor time is realized therein. In addition to money, labor is one of the forms of so-called real abstractions produced by capitalism. With the use of human labor, the value of raw materials and other means of production, whose value is constant, and this is what Marx called constant capital, is only transferred to the products. While as special commodity, labor power has the specific characteristic that besides its own value, which is expressed in wage or in the value of its own reproduction, it also adds to the new products a surcharge or additional value, which is why Marx named this part of capital reserved for the purchase of the labor power variable capital, since its value multiplies in the process of production. Being used, labor power reproduces all the past value of raw materials used thereby and the means of the production and the value of itself as labor power, while adding a surcharge to all this. The surcharge is created due to what Marx calls, of course, surplus labor. Surplus labor is precisely the difference between the labor time spent on the reproduction of value, including the reproduction of the value of labor power, measured in wages, and the entire labor time for which the worker has hired out his or her own labor power. The value or the price of labor power is always smaller than the value of the performed labor. Put differently, a worker does not work only during the labor time in which he or she creates the value that is equivalent to the value of his or her wages, but also during the additional or surplus labor time in which he or she creates surplus value that exceeds the reproduction of all other values. It is precisely this surplus labor that it is the source of the surplus value. Surplus labor that it is the source of surplus value, which in Marx is further divided into interests, rate, rent, and of course the profit. That is why the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit depend especially on the proportion between the value or price of labor power and the value that labor power creates in the production process. The higher the value of labor power, measured in wages, the lower the final rate of profit, and vice versa. But the value of labor power never, will never be equal in capitalism to the created value. In that case, the rate of profit would be, of course, zero. It is precisely this difference between the two values that Marx calls exploitation, which is, as you all know, completely formal, objective, and independent of the subjective feeling of exploitation. It exists where there is a surplus labor, which exists in turn where there are capitalist relations of production, regardless of the workers' subjective feelings of being exploited or not. With these basic elements of buying and selling of labor power, the abstraction of labor and surplus labor, which constitute the system of wage labor, we obtain not only two, but all three necessary elements of the capitalist accumulation of capital. One, the reproduction of the existing value of raw materials and of labor power. The production of the production of the surplus value deriving from the surplus labor time. And three, what Marx calls the semblance of labor, this is quote unquote, which is precisely the ideological supplement necessary for the ideological reproduction of capitalist relations of production. I will now examine this supplement in more detail. I mentioned that the source of the surplus value is surplus labor, which Marx correctly notes is unpaid labor. But to this, Marx immediately adds that the peculiarity of the wage system and, let us say, of the ideological success of capitalism, which is based on wage labor, is precisely that, quote unquote, unpaid labor seems to be paid labor, end of quote. Short quote from Wage, Price and Profit. Although one part only of the workman's daily labor is paid, while the other part is unpaid, and while the unpaid or surplus labor constitutes exactly the found out of which surplus value or profit is formed, it seems as if the aggregate labor was paid labor. So the whole amount of labor was paid labor. This, and this is important, this false appearance distinguishes wage labor from other historical forms of labor, end of quote. Marx believes that the first reason for this false appearance, according to which the, quote unquote again, the value or price of the laboring power takes the semblance of the price or value of labor itself, that's the crucial quote, should be sought in the known time lag between the production process of creating value and the payment of the workers' wages, which are paid out only after the weekly or monthly cycle of the production process has been completed. But this is not the only reason, or rather it consists in two parts. The second and perhaps even more important reason that produces the anamorphic objective fiction according to which the value of labor power or a wage takes the semblance of the value of labor power itself, that in capitalism, as opposed to previous historical forms of labor, the paid and unpaid proportions of labor are not formally separated. They are part of the same abstract labor time and space. There is no objective or external dividing line between them that would enable one to differentiate between paid and unpaid labor, or the hours a worker spends on production of value that is equivalent to his or her wages, and the surplus labor appropriated by the owner of capital. The structure of surplus labor is the same as the structure of entropy mentioned by Lacan in his example of descending and ascending the hill with the weight on one's back. If we take into account only the signifiers of the energetics, then the calculated work is zero, even though we know that the real work was performed, that is, a real loss of energy took place. So the peculiarity of the wage system on which capitalism and the production of surplus value are based lies precisely in merging the paid and the unpaid proportions of labor time, thereby producing the appearance that all performed labor is paid labor, meaning that during the entire labor time, workers produce the value that they are later paid for by their wages. The objective existence of the unpaid labor is manifested only on the unconscious other thing, so to speak, in the persistence of the surplus value within the capitalist knowledge as a stain. Without unpaid labor, there would be no surplus value and consequently no profit. The key point here is that the semblance of labor does not emerge outside the framework of the capitalist productions or in the ideological superstructure, which includes the human rights, the observance of the contractual and legal relations which the purchase and sale of labor power are based on, but is produced by the relations of production themselves or by the wage system. Precisely because of this false appearance originates not in the ideological apparatuses outside production, but in the mode of production itself. It corresponds to the term what I propose to call objective fiction. A fiction or appearance that is not simply a consequence of false subjective view, but is produced by objective reality or the discourse of capitalism itself. Ideology is already inscribed in the social base. At this point, we come across a question of a precise structure of this false appearance and the related question of which I'm not going to discuss in further details, but just to mention, a related question of how Marx even manages to see the difference between paid and unpaid labor or surplus labor within the structure of this false appearance that precisely erases this difference. In short, how does Marx trace within the entire labor time in which there is no manifest difference between the work hours during which the value of labor is reproduced and the hours that constitute surplus labor time, the difference between two separate segments, the second of which, surplus labor, is the source of the surplus value. If I anticipate a bit, I can say that at first sight, the structure of this false appearance and Marx's conception of it are reminiscent of Lacan's conceptualization of anamorphosis as the structure of the gaze within the field of vision, which Lacan develops while considering the famous stain in the form of which takes the form of the human skull in Holbein's masterpiece, The Ambassadors from 1533. If we assume that the already well-documented homology between psychoanalysis and historical materialism, and if we presuppose the anamorphosis is the screening of the object A, as Mladen says, that is, the way the lack appears in the field of the lack or nothingness appears in the field of vision, then we can say that within the capitalist production process, surplus value in the form of surplus labor, homologically appears precisely in the form of anamorphosis. The last section, structure of surplus value, which is the structure of anamorphosis. Lacan provides his first, and again, I'm sure you are all very well aware of all this I'm going to talk about, and just want to make the connection between the appearance, the false appearance in Marx and the appearance of the stain in Anamorphosis. Lacan provides his first more extensive analysis of the phenomenon of anamorphosis in Holbein's The Ambassadors. In his seminar 7, where he points out, among other things, that anamorphosis is a distinctly modern phenomenon. It appears especially in 16th and 17th century European painting, which in the structural sense follows the changes in the field of modern science, especially geometry and the discovery of quote-unquote geometrical laws of perspective. According to its basic definition, anamorphosis is a spatial illusion, or quote, any kind of construction that is made in such a way that by means of an optical transposition, a certain form that was not visible at first sight transforms itself into a readable image. The pleasure is found in seeing its emergence from an undecipherable form. And you can observe these dialectics between the painting and the stain in Holbein's Ambassadors. The anamorphic painting technique thus introduces an additional twist to the classical painting techniques. For by including a stain in the painting or constructing a painting within a painting, it produces a materialization of the void or an extimate surface, which is extimate precisely because two spaces come together on the same surface and thereby become twisted and curved, so that the outside and the inside appear on the same curved space and are no longer separated from each other. As has been said many times, the main point of anamorphosis developed by Lacan in Seminar 11, based on the paradoxical stain in Holbein Ambassadors, is that the gaze is the object. That is, it does not belong to the subject that stands opposite to the external objects, but as such belongs to the painting itself or the geometrical field of the visible. The gaze is not a medium of cognition, but is something that the subject encounters in the painting in the transition from the whole painting to the unclear stain as a painting within a painting, which, with the change in perspective, turns out to be a human skull. The price to be paid is, of course, losing the rest of the painting the moment the stain turns out to be an image meaning. Lacan's emphasis here, however, is not so much on the fact that with the change of perspective, the stain changes into a meaningful image, but on the gaze as the objectia being an external objective materialization or the representative of the subject as a lack of being. In the field of the visible, the subject, as a lack of being, is inscribed in the painting together with his or her desire precisely to the presentation of the gaze as the objectia. It is this structure that enables the satisfaction of desire and produces of what Lacan calls jouissance in a stronger sense from a successful deciphering of the stain. The stain in Holbein's painting can thus function as a screen or a stand-in for the gaze, as to borrow Mladen Dolar's expression once again, precisely because it corresponds to the basic characteristic of the objectia in Lacan. That is, it is actually an anti-image, since it does not have its specular image or otherness. And just a short quote from the subversion of the subject, where Lacan famously says, a common characteristic of these objects, as I formulate them, is that they have no specular image. In other words, no alterity. So Lacan points here thus lies not simply in the satisfaction gained from the successful deciphering of the unclear image or stain, but rather that in so doing, one already transforms the stain into a positive image, thereby losing its very function as the one existing merely as a disturbing or detotalizing moment in the painting, and not as a separated from it in any way. For the stain is not the other image, an autonomous entity, which breaks into the field of the visual from the outside, but the other of the image or painting itself, an internal short circuit in the field of vision itself. The success of deciphering the stain as a positive image already conceals the fact that the field of the visible is detotalized as an ontological, at the ontological level, and not on the ontic level merely. That is why, as I already mentioned, Lacan's key points about the phenomenon of anamorphosis does not lie in deciphering the enigmatic stain itself, but in actualizing the stain as a stand-in for the subject in the painting. Put differently, the gaze as an object belongs to the geometrical field of the visible, and as such is also a marker for the place of the subject inscription into the painting itself. The subject and the object are no longer separated in the sense of the interior and the exterior of the painting, but belongs to the same field as its effects. It seems that surplus value in Marx has exactly the same structure as the anamorphic stain in Holbein's Ambassadors. Even more, it seems that at the level of the painting, the Ambassadors even directly visualizes this structural paradox. It does so not only at the level of the structural relation between the stain and the entire painting that I have discussed thus far, but also at the level of the depicted figures, whereby Ambassadors visualizes the real of the structure in both senses of the word. The painting depicts nothing other than the modern scientific knowledge itself, two ambassadors surrounded by the instruments of knowledge and technical tools characteristics of modern science, which is precisely the knowledge that is established with the spoliation of slaves' practical knowledge, or savoir-faire, that is, with the separation of knowledge from the slave's labor. This separation simultaneously transforms the labor itself, which, with this discursive break or change in the master's discourse, as Lacan says, acquires a form of entropic surplus labor, which Lacan marks with the objectia in a stronger sense. And the entropic surplus labor that becomes countable in capitalism, that's the main point. One of Lacan's points regarding surplus labor as entropic loss is precisely that it becomes invisible from the point of view of modern knowledge. In descending and ascending the hill along the same path, the signifiers of energetics, as I mentioned, say that no work was performed. In the same way, when looking at the painting as a whole, the human skull appears as a stain. And perhaps it is no coincidence that in the ambassadors, surplus labor, which is the source of the surplus value and surplus jouissance, is depicted precisely by a stain that, with a change of perspective, obtains the image of a human skull, which is, of course, a classical image of death. In this respect, in the ambassadors, the stain as the materialization of the surplus value and surplus jouissance, is depicted precisely by a skull as a metaphor of the death drive, which is materialized in the gaze as the objectia in the painting. However, the point here lies not in deciphering the stain or the surplus, whereby we would lose the rest of the painting, but rather in the fact that, as in the case of entropy, the stain emerges only within the painting itself and does not exist independently thereof. We come across precisely the same point as to the production of the surplus value in Marx, who claims that in the production process, surplus value is produced as its surplus and not as an autonomous, independent entity. If surplus labor is the fount of abstract labor time, from which there derives surplus value, then we shall say that this amount of labor time is not an independent amount, and that at the phenomenal level it cannot be clearly separated from the amount of labor from the time used for the reproduction of the value of labor power. In the case of producing surplus value, we should rather say that surplus labor sticks to abstract labor precisely as an internal stain, an internal short circuit that cannot be visually separated from entire amount of abstract labor, but rather functions as a purely formal internal discursive surplus over the signifying articulation through which capitalist production is organized. If surplus value would be only an extra discursive addition, then this form of exploitation would rather correspond to the pre-capitalist feudal form of labor and not to the wage system on which capitalism is based on. And it seems that one of the main ideological features of the infinite accumulation of capital is nothing other than the constant attempt at deciphering this traumatic stain. The owners of capital constantly reinvest surplus value and thereby attempt to increase the volume of production and consequently accumulation, while the owners of labor power decipher it precisely by recognizing in it a positive image. The wage as the image of their own value of labor power, which is nothing other than the false appearance according to which the value of labor power appears as the value of labor itself. And do I have a couple of, not 1 minute more. Okay, that's it.
We have like 10 minutes or so for questions.
Thank you so much. It was just absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Look, I'm just thinking, looking at the Holbein painting, and I just loved the articulation that you gave of it, I'm really struck by how many sort of circular shapes you see in the image that seem to replicate the ellipse of the anamorphotic stain. And just sort of thinking about the idea that that's the unpaid labor has some kind of visualization, as you're talking about, that becomes the image of the wage. But whether there are ways of visualizing and articulating the that visual sort of similarity between what we see inside the diegetic space of the Holbein painting.
Sorry, can you repeat what we see?
So what we see is the should I start again or just the last bit? So the way that we see these circular images inside the diegetic space of the painting, so traces of the anamorphosis that are articulated in this three-dimensional space, whether there's something similar that we can think about with the analogy of unpaid labor, the image of the wage that is the false appearance of our value, where those other kinds of sort of mimetic or similar relations might be circulating in the economic diegetic space.
Just a counter question, seeking the clarification. Do you, and thanks for everything you said, do you aim at, do you have in mind the unpaid labor which derives from the surplus labor time, or are you aiming at the other forms of unpaid labor which are very much discussed in the, like a housework, or did you have the first kind of labor in?
I think you've already answered the question. I didn't have anything in particular in mind, but I think,
okay, yeah. Because of those other forms, I would say there are absolutely, those other forms I would even claim are very much visible. To the contrary of the unpaid labor within the entire labor time that Marx is talking about, which can be only deduced if the gaze focuses on the other scene, on the reinvestments of capital, where there is the driver of the logic is a kind of stain that needs to be put in circulation again and again, and should not stop at any point. I don't know whether did I.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Boštjan. I just have two clarifying questions. One is about the term real abstraction and the way that you see it as relating to objective fictions. If you see a difference between this, the one term real abstraction coming from Sohn-Rethel and his account of Marx's critique of capital as a critique of Kantian subjectivity, and whether you see objective fictions as another name for the same thing in real abstraction or something distinct.
To cut a long story short, I would say yes, even though there is always a question of discussing much of the details on which real abstraction might differ from a general term objective fiction. But in principle, I would say yes, there are there is a proximity, even an overlapping between the two. Real abstraction is an objective fiction, I would say.
Great. And then the one other clarification was around the idea of the shift from slave...
Sorry, the idea?
The idea of the shift from slave labor to wage labor that Marx is identifying. Do you see this, therefore, as a distinction between kind of Marx's account of the subject and Hegel's account of the subject, in the sense of the master-slave dialectic being a certain foundation for a structure of the subject, and if wage labor becomes the foundation for the structure of a modern subject in Marx, does this mean Marx has a different account of the subject than Hegel?
This is $1 million question, but it might be said that way, even though this is a quite longer paper in which it's meant to be a critique of Foucault's idea of human capital, where he essentializes the labor and completely misses the whole Marx account and the theory of value. And it's really a horror thing to observe how, like Alenka noted very well, that how if history of sexuality is a critique of psychoanalysis without even mentioning the key concept, which is the unconscious, so the birth of biopolitics, or the seminar where he discusses and criticizes the theory of labor and the political economy, is actually, he doesn't even mention labor theory of value when he discusses Marx, which is, well, yeah, very, very, very strange fact. But I would say in principle, yes, even though then Marx was the main achievement, and this is the detail I didn't go into, the main achievement of Marx is precisely that he traced the place of the subject in the production process of capitalism, the proletariat, so to speak. And this is why I would say his political economy is still a materialist theory, because it traces the place of the subject as the effect, as a stand-in for the process of the accumulation of capital. Cannot say much more than that, even though you said a lot of with this comparison between Hegel and Marx.
Yeah, we have time for one final question.
Echoing also the other comments that was really wonderful. I mean, I guess my question would be, again, touching on the relationship between paid and unpaid labor. And in particular, I mean, I think that the paper sort of tended towards, emphasizing, let's say, the purely structural dimension. But one aspect, I mean, this is more of, I mean, maybe we don't disagree, but how I've always read this moment in Marx is that there's also a shift between, on the one hand, in Capital, the ideal construction, which then poses the problem of how do we account for this surplus exploitation? Because on the ideal structure, it ought to just be, a pure system of equivalence.
Sorry, on the... I'm really struggling to hear.
Yeah, sorry, it echoes. But maybe just a quick, maybe the way to really cut to the heart of what I'm asking is that to some extent, the historical rate of exploitation appears at that moment where the ideal structure also is inscribed historically. And then so that there's actually a historical rate of exploitation, so that there's always a shift in Marx between, on the one hand, the conceptual construction and then its inscription within a historical process. And likewise, let's say, homologously, one gets in the painting. In some sense, there's the positionality of, let's say, the bodily subject that has to actually move in order to inscribe the difference between the perspectival space, between the stain and the place of its inscription. So that in both moments, there's also this other, let's say, dimension, which would be the historical dimension, that's also not, let's say, homologous to the purely structural one. Do you see the question?
I couldn't agree more, because at one point I even say that Marx's articulation of the answer to the question of countability of the surplus value qua surplus jouissance is historical. And yes, on the one hand, he gives the account of the ideal structure, but at the same time, even if we say that this is the ideal structure, Marx is constantly in the polemical discussions with even the wage profit and wage price and profit is, for example, a direct polemic with all those theories that seeing the same thing, observing the same capital accumulation, thought that, for example, the source of profit is comes from adding, increasing the price with respect to the costs of production, and not the surplus labor time. So already to achieve this ideal structure, what you've called, Marx needs to think historically. What is going on at the level of the historical accumulation of capital as a historical process. I don't know if I answered, but
Well, thank you, Boštjan. Join me in thanking Boštjan. Thanks a lot.